This is a video about one of the most important developments in skill learning, and it all started in the 1920s with a scientist called Nikolai Bernstein. Oh, and a hammer. This hammer is the reason why repetitive skill practice and common technique drills are actually an inefficient way of learning technique. To understand why a beginner climber can't execute a technique as well as an experienced climber, assuming all other variables are the same, we first need to understand how we as humans perform a complex movement. After serving in the Red Army and returning from World War I, Nikolai Bernstein was tasked with improving the productivity of blacksmiths cutting sheet metal with a chisel and a hammer. He was asked to make the novice blacksmiths more reliable and more precise in their work so they could improve productivity. Bernstein measured the trajectory of the hammer, and what he found was fascinating. As you might expect, the novice or unskilled workers would have a lot of variation between each movement, and the outcome of that was obviously very variable. But when he looked at the really experienced blacksmiths, he also found a huge amount of variation. No hammer stroke was exactly the same, but the outcomes were much more reliable and much more precise. Bernstein coined this repetition without repetition. Essentially, the more skilled could achieve the same goal, but without repetition of a movement. Why does this happen, and why is it important? When we consider a skill like hitting a chisel with a hammer, we would think this is quite a repeatable task, and the more skilled we get, the more we get better at just repeating the same movement exactly the same each time. But even with a movement as simple as this, there are huge amounts of degrees of freedom. If we just think of the joints involved, we've got the wrist, we've got the elbow, the shoulder, and any movement in the trunk as well, meaning that this simple movement can actually be really chaotic. Rafael Nadal, one of the best tennis players in the world, had this to say about variation within movement. You might think after the millions and millions of balls I've hit, I'd have the basic shots of tennis show up, that reliably hitting a true, smooth, clean shot every time would be a piece of cake. But it isn't. Not just because every day you wake up feeling different, but because every single shot is different. Every single one. What Bernstein found was that most of the variation movement was coming from the wrist, the elbow, and the shoulder, but actually the hammer was following a very similar path each time. So essentially, the most skilled blacksmiths were able to make minor corrections in a dynamic movement so that the hammer landed true each time. These minor corrections made on the fly is what someone like Rafael Nadal does so well. When we understand that even a simple movement has a huge amount of variation and is never repeated exactly the same any one time, we embrace the fact that movement is inherently filled with a huge amount of variation. What the research is pretty clear on now is that we want to embrace this variability in our training and not distill our movement practice down to an isolated environment where we don't have all of this noise going on around us. In fact, those that distill practice down to just simple repeated drills will limit their learning. So we know variation is always present in our movement, even simple movements that we do. So why do we need variation within practice? Why can't we just perform isolated drills like repeating drop knees, repeating heel hooks, and then have that all come together later on when we try and apply it to a performance setting or within our sport? There is a good reason why this approach only works on very novice athletes or someone new to the sport. And it has to do with how we coordinate movement. One train of thought, which is probably a bit outdated now, is that when we perform a movement, it works in a hierarchy or a command chain, coming from the command center, our brain. So our brain sends a command, which goes down for our nervous system and executes a movement by contracting our muscles. Think of this like writing a computer program and clicking run. However, we don't have this chain of command or hierarchy within our movement. We can't train the individual components and then just put them all together later on within sports practice. Movement is what we call self-organised. Essentially, there are multiple interactions happening simultaneously between our environment, our perception, and our movement. Think of that hammer strike. There was so much variation between each movement that actually to be able to correct the movement on the way with this infinite amount of variability, this needs to be self-organised, because a command which is sent from the start to the finish, if that isn't able to adapt and change, the outcomes won't improve over time if the variability is always present to a movement. This self-organised movement is interlocked with a mechanism we call action-perception coupling. I perceive a hold to be quite far away, and my action changes to put slightly more momentum through my hips to make that distance. That's how it works on a basic level anyways. The idea that our actions are coupled together with our perception is extremely important when we come together to design skill practice and sessions later in this video. There are two big benefits to this self-organised movement. The first is that it finds movement solutions intuitively. You don't need a command center to say something like raise my foot 1 meter and externally rotate my hips 3.5 degrees. And secondly, it is robust to errors in your movement. So if you put your foot slightly wrong, your perception will change and the action might be dropping the hips slightly further away. So we can correct for movements as they're happening. If we had a command center, coaching would be easy. We could take an athlete and teach them all of the techniques, tell them when to use them, and then just let them go practice, and it would all come together in the sporting environment. But actually, if we try this, we find that it's not very sticky. These things don't tend to keep together when it actually comes to trying to climb. What we end up doing is getting really good at the techniques in a distilled environment, but not within our sport. But with self-organisation, how do we influence it? Do we just sit back and let it play out because it's happening within the individual? Do we just clock up our 10,000 hours of deliberate practice and hope by the end of it we're a super skilled athlete? When we see a climber in the gym for the first time, we can see self-organisation and action perception coupling at play. But it's not exactly like watching Adam Ondra move. Clearly they're not self-organising to a very good level, or they're not finding good solutions. They might be overexerting themselves by trying to lock off everything, and maybe they're placing their feet badly with the arch of their foot on a big foothold rather than placing their toe. So how do we get them to self-organise better? One answer comes from the constraints-led approach. Essentially, we need to eliminate some opportunities or possibilities for their movement so they can self-organise in the way that we want them to move. Importantly, they are problem solving themselves and we are not telling them what to do. They are finding the solution. There are three main ways in which the constraints-led approach says we can remove these options for the climber or athlete. And this comes in the form of task constraints, individual constraints, and environmental constraints. Constraints essentially force the athlete to move in a certain way we want to influence. For example, if we take football and we put the whole team on half the pitch, so we give them a really small pitch to work on, we force the athletes to look harder for opening spaces and moving between a denser field of play. Let's go through a few examples of constraints within climbing, going through the individual, environmental, and task constraints. Let's take Will Bosie for example. If I'm having a climbing session with Will Bosie and we're working on the same boulder problem, those holds are going to be relatively a lot worse for me. I'm going to have more individual constraints because of our strength differences. Will Bosie will be able to have more movement opportunities because he's a stronger athlete than me. All of these individual characteristics come into the individual constraints. So a fitter, a stronger, a more skilled athlete will have more movement options available to them than someone that is less skilled. This is one of the reasons I don't really like it when people say just climb more to get better at climbing, because strength, flexibility, and fitness all play into the movement skills that you can acquire as an athlete. As you can probably tell, a lot of these individual constraints are a bit more fixed. We're not going to influence them so much, but they will change over time. The main thing to be aware of here is just understanding that different people will have different individual constraints. When climbing outside, we have the wind, we have the humidity, we have the heat. And we can't really influence these so much, but we can obviously choose to take on different environmental constraints on different days. But inside, we have more fun things to play with. A relatively modern addition to indoor setting is dual text holds, or sometimes no text holds. And these are going to change the environment that we're interacting with and the climbs that we're doing. This is probably what us as coaches will change and influence more often, because we can make it highly specific to the skill or the outcome we want the athlete to achieve within a task. Things you might have heard or seen used before is like climbing with straight arms and not allowing them to bend, or the one touch rule where you're only allowed to grab a hold and not do any adjustment. This places a constraint on the movement or a task, so the athlete might have to find a new, more efficient solution to what they were already doing. The amazing thing about task constraints is they can be used to direct practice towards certain opportunities we want to give the athlete. And these opportunities are better described within the field of sports science as affordances. Essentially, what can we afford the athlete in a certain situation to help shift them or encourage them to move in a certain way? The idea of affordances keeps it individual to the athlete. So if we take a dyno in the gym, we have to move from one hold to the other with a big dynamic movement. For a tall climber versus a short climber, we've afforded them different opportunities here. For the tall climber, we've afforded them maybe a slightly smaller move. Maybe they can even keep their foot on holds. But for a shorter climber, we've afforded them a very dynamic move. This is why you'll see a basketball hoop lowered when juniors play basketball. It affords them more opportunities to actually make shots into the hoop. It's going to improve self-efficacy and how they feel about the task, and they can still develop the skills, and as they get taller, they're still afforded the same challenge. Outside of your anatomy, your strength and flexibility will also change the affordances from individual to individual. Even if you take two climbers at the top of their game, Daniel Woods and Will Bosey, when they climbed Return of the Sleepwalker, they still found different solutions for the same boulder problem. They had different affordances given to them. Both very strong climbers, but choosing different beta. This is why training and things like strength and conditioning is an excellent way to change your individual constraints and also make sure that you have more opportunities afforded to you as a climber. So this point has afforded me about 15 seconds to mention. If you want to sign up for a Lattice training plan, I'll put a link in the description below. This gets you a completely bespoke training plan, which is always written to your own specifications. We don't believe in cookie cutter plans because we think training should always be individual to you, and that also includes your technique training. So back to the video. Okay, so we have the idea of constraints now, and these are the things that we're going to manipulate and change to help direct our practice. But we can use constraints in two different ways when it comes to planning our training. The first is to amplify errors in our movement, and in some cases take away possible movement solutions. Route setters obviously do this all the time. They're trying to direct you, and they can amplify errors. One way, in which you mentioned earlier, is with dual texture footholds. They might give you a big foothold, but you'll have to place it precisely on the right part of that foothold to actually get any friction out of it. A task constraint of 0 cutting loose while doing a climb means that if you lose tension at all and your feet swing off the holds, you have to repeat the task, distilling the idea that we're trying to root and create tension through our feet as we're climbing. The second way is to create more opportunities, and in some cases specific opportunities or affordances, so that that athlete gets encouraged to choose a certain path or movement solution. We have a very talented climber in the UK called Dan Varian who climbs on his board without any climbing shoes. He does this to strengthen his toes, but you can also see how he will have to find different ways of climbing, specifically on certain holds, to be able to maintain tension and do certain moves. But we need to ask ourselves if a certain task constraint is creating the right affordances and teaching good habits, or if the task constraint is perhaps maybe a bit pointless and maybe teaching bad habits when it comes to movement. The classic movement drill of silent feet might be a great way to amplify errors of bad or inaccurate foot placement. But if the outcome is making the climber pointlessly really slow in their foot placement and maybe gingerly weighting their feet, is this actually the outcome we want from a climber? I've also seen bottle corks placed on footholds with a similar rationale to silent feet. We have to work really slowly to get our foot around the bottle cork and not knock it off. The idea is that this will improve foot accuracy. But I've often seen this done in such an isolated environment, traversing on a wall with really big footholds, where we don't really need to focus on anything else, that we've isolated the environment so much so that what we're probably doing is getting good at walking around corks on a wall and maybe not necessarily getting better at actually climbing. I can see the value of this very early on to maybe understand concepts in climbing, but also we have to really question its transferability to climbing later on. Ultimately, constraints are used in the coaching environment to guide self-organisation away from certain movement solutions and towards the desired solution that we think they should have as a coach. But designing practice doesn't need to come from a coach. It can easily be you in a climbing wall or with friends setting up a design which is going to help guide your own movement. Importantly, the coach is taking a bit of a step back in this situation and letting the athlete and climber find the solutions themselves. This needs to happen with all of the noise around the sport, all of the variability, and not distilling it down to its basic components of movement. This is why error amplification works so well. The climber will find that their current movement solution is insufficient for the task, and what we find is that a more efficient movement solution emerges through self-organisation. This isn't to say techniques will change completely, it's more how the technique is performed, how the subtleties of the movement happens, and how the body corrects for them. When we find that this kind of skill is learned, it's more sticky. We find that it's going to transfer better to a performance in climbing. Before we cover another important consideration of movement attractors, which explains why being really strong can make you climb worse, let's go for a few task constraints that can be used to amplify errors and improve your climbing technique. One-handed climbing or no-handed climbing. With this movement drill, essentially we're trying to amplify the error of putting too much weight through your upper body, through your fingers and your shoulders, and not getting the weight through your feet. When you're doing this drill, it's obvious that if you do not put weight through your feet, you do not have confidence in your movement, you do not trust your footwork, you're going to fall off the wall and have more foot slips. It's going to amplify the error that we're putting too much weight into our hands. This one can also be used if you want to improve your balance and shift your weight from one foothold to the other without using your upper body to do that work. Micro rests. This is a good drill if you find that you're overly dynamic between movements. Essentially what we want to do here is encourage people to find a stable base between each move. So you take a hand off, you can have a few shakes as if you're sport climbing, and then you can make a move to the next hold. If you're not establishing a good base, you're going to find positions like barn dooring or overexerting yourself in your upper body. It can also be used to encourage momentum used from the hand with a kind of hand pogo move from hold to hold. Someone with a long sport climbing background probably won't find this one that useful. Board pauses. This is here to amplify the error of not being able to cut momentum from a cut loose. There's specific skills involved with cutting loose, which involves in shortening the levers, either through the legs or potentially the shoulders as well, getting the weight into the hands. It also encourages dynamic foot placement, which I think is underemphasized in climbing skill. After a cut loose position, you want to place your foot back on the wall with accuracy and with speed. With this exercise, you want to maintain tension through the move and then cut loose with control. You're not just jumping from hold to hold, because we don't want to encourage people to have poor tension when doing climbing on steep terrain. One touch. This is a simple one where it's going to be used for people that spend a lot of time adjusting their grip positions. It can also be used if you're very fast between holds and you want to slow it down subtly. The constraint simply is that when you hit a hand hold, you're not allowed to adjust and you need to move from it. Clearly you can see here that if you have a poor grip position, you're going to amplify the error of that mistake, and it's going to be much harder to achieve a climb. Understanding why you're doing one of these exercises is crucial. When we're working with an athlete, we're not working with a blank slate. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses and past experiences, and this will influence how they self-organize when it comes to a movement solution. This is based heavily on their perception of a task, so that includes their psychology, their physical attributes, and their past experiences. For a long time, I really wanted to understand why really strong but new climbers would move so inefficiently on the wall. If I watched a new climber that clearly was very, very strong, maybe they'd been hitting the gym for many years, maybe they were a gymnast or trained with calisthenics, when you watch them climb, they clearly were leaving so much efficiency on the floor and almost climbing robotically on the wall. Obviously, they could climb like this because they had so much strength, but why would they if there was an easier movement solution for them? Even after many years of climbing practice, you could see it was still holding them back in some ways. Well, I now think I have an answer from the science of skill acquisition, and this is in the form of attractors. An attractor is essentially a value within your perceptual motor landscape, which will draw that self-organized movement solution to what it perceives to be effective. This is even if a more efficient movement solution is nearby. Remember, this is self-organized, so you won't be super conscious of it. Let's take an example of a weightlifter, which has spent many, many years learning to tense and stabilize through multiple joints in a compound lift. Then when it comes to climbing, and we want to just isolate a contraction maybe through one hamstring and a hand, but relax everything else to try and move efficiently, the more efficient movement solution becomes clouded by their perception and these attractors. I could even conceive that spending too much time on strength and conditioning with the aim of improving your performance very early on in your climbing career might actually hinder your ability to develop good technique. Essentially, you might be artificially creating attractors towards solutions in your climbing which require more strength and less efficiency. That is not to say strength and conditioning is not useful for improving your capacity to climb more and practice more skill and also mitigate injury risk. But the distribution between strength training and skill practice needs to be carefully considered in any training plan. We obviously want to move well and not get injured. In many ways, these over-strong athletes would benefit from unlearning some bad habits. Actually, put more accurately, shifting these attractor valleys towards more efficient movement solutions. So maybe there is such a thing as too much power. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Even in my own climbing, I think I can see these attractive valleys happening. My past climbing experience was mostly about sport climbing and mostly just on-sighting. I rarely ever red pointed anything. So I was always looking for efficient movement solutions and maybe being a little bit more cautious between moves. In contrast, when I am climbing on a board, I kind of suck at being able to cut loose because I have to try really hard and pull into the wall. It's just not a style of climbing that I ever exposed myself to for so long. And now I have to work quite hard to change my movement when I'm in that style of climbing. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have someone that's been board climbing for the past several years on a 45-degree board. Their climbing style might be much more tense, much more about core tension, but put them onto an area where they need to move really efficiently for a long space of time, they might find it really hard to move in a different way because these attractive valleys have been carved out from many years of their experience. This means that no two athletes are the same. If you take the robot or sloth drill, which I've seen performed, essentially you need to move really slowly between holds, even really slowly with your footwork. But there are some athletes which might already have these attractive valleys carved out to move slowly in their climbing. So actually, is this a useful drill for them, or is it instilling bad habits in their climbing? Essentially, my recommendation is to not pointlessly do movement drills, just like you wouldn't do some random exercise that you'd seen on Instagram. With very capable climbers that have deep attractive valleys towards certain movement solutions, we want to invite new affordances and try and shift those attractive valleys into new areas. Let's take a really strong climber that has a very square on style and will lock off between lots of moves. And as a coach, let's say we want to improve their ability to twist on the wall and move more fluidly with momentum. To help this climber, we want to destabilize their existing movement solutions and attractors. Using a constraints-led approach, we can actually apply constraints to amplify movement solutions that we think are more desirable. So obviously for that athlete, it would be twisting and momentum, but we can do the same for creating tension and other skills. For this drill, you're only allowed 1 foothold as you make any move. So you can use multiple footholds, but if you're going to move a hand, you can only be on 1 foothold at a time. If you do this on the same side of the body, so left hand, left foot, it will encourage inside flagging and back flagging. You can also use this to encourage more square on movement using opposite hand and foot. This will encourage more outside flagging and pressure into the wall. If you take this drill onto steeper terrain and we use the same side hand and foot, where the flagging isn't possible, we'll find that this drill tends to encourage more pogoing or dynamic movement. In this drill, we need to move both hands at the same time. At a very basic level, this is going to encourage momentum for upward movement and driving the hips into the wall for dead pointing exercises. Another benefit to this one is it can improve coordination and accuracy, particularly between two hands. And you can see how this is a useful skill for someone that's working more towards competition climbing. Eliminates or add-ons. Eliminates and add-ons are very similar exercises. With add-ons, you're going to add 1 climb on each time, and it's nice to alternate this between climbing partners. With eliminates, you're going to take an existing climb and gradually remove holds. In this way, the climbers themselves are creating constraints gradually to a climb or building constraints into a climb. It's important you have an aim with this one. So with eliminates, are you removing holds so that you have to create bigger gaps and move more dynamically? Or are you removing the big holds so that you have to create more tension through the feet? One of the best things about the constraints-led approach is that it encourages individualism and creativity. And these things are particularly important to a sport where we all have such different body shapes, climbing styles, and of course, no climb is ever the same. Even if we look at athletes at the very top of their game, Stefano, Jakob, and Adam, all of these climbers are performing right at the very top, but arguably have very different climbing styles. Stefano has a fingers first approach, Adam has a hip flexibility and efficiency approach, and then Jakob has a really power and body strength approach to climbing. If we asked all of these climbers to find the same solution to any problem, we'd likely be limiting them in how hard they could climb. The fact that they can all find their own way to climb at the very top level is actually probably what helped them get there in the first place. That's it for this video, but if you want to see more on everything to do with training for climbing, make sure you subscribe to the channel. It helps us grow and supports us make more content like this. Thank you for watching. See you next time.